where every clue hides a secret, and every secret has a story.
Lucien kicked the splintered latch. The atelier door gave with a wooden groan and rain drove against his coat. Suspicion tightened his jaw as he shouldered inside. Claudette Moreau stood by the easel, palms pressed to the canvas edge, voice raw in the hush. "An apprentice is gone," she said. "Did not answer when I called at dawn." The statement was an accusation the room could not swallow. He moved before he could think the thought through. Lucien's gloved hand brushed the wet floor by the doorway. Paint spots left a scattered map to the easel. He smelled turpentine and the metallic tang of rain tracking from the threshold. His thumb found the brass of his pocket watch and turned it until the rim caught the skin. That small, controlled irritation steadied him. Claudette kept rubbing at her sleeves, fingers clumsy with nerve. "Slept on the cot," she said. And the sentence sounded like a plea. This morning the cot was empty, and the portrait. She stopped, eyes fixed on the canvas as if the room might speak the rest. Lucien stepped closer. The portrait's face sat under a half-finished veil of varnish and brushwork, Madame Lenoir's mouth set in a small curl that looked almost deliberate. Suspicion drove his first questions. "When did you last see him?" he asked. His own name aloud only when needed. His actions usually announced him better than a badge. Claudette found the words again. "Late last night. He fetched linseed for Mile, and I heard him breathe in the back room. At dawn gone." She turned and fumbled with a key on a ribbon. Her hands shook. Lucien checked the cot. The straw was pressed flat on one side and untouched on the other. A boot print in soaked dust led toward the window. He crouched and traced the print with gloved fingers. The shape of the heel matched the apprentice's boot that Claudette described. He noted the print's angle. It suggested someone had stepped out as if heading to the courtyard. He felt the first true spike of doubt. The disappearance might not be an accident. He examined the easel. The portrait had fresh strokes near the left eye. The paint was tacky along the canvas edge. Lucien lifted the edge and peered behind. A scrap of torn paper had been forced into the frame, folded twice. He eased it free with a fingernail. The paper carried a line. "Please do not let me become a memory." Here the writing was cramped and hurried. Lucien's hand tightened on the scrap until the paper creased between his fingers. "Madame Lenoir wrote that." Claudette, voice twisted. She sank onto a cracked stool. "Do not know. It was behind the canvas this morning." I thought. She stopped. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She had kept the studio tidy for years. The intrusion of a folded letter felt like a broken promise. Lucien folded the scrap and slid it into an inner pocket. He needed facts, not fear. He moved to the far window and pushed the shutters. Rain slit the courtyard into wet silver. The paint on the floor led to a small worn hatch between the workbenches. Someone had brushed against the chest of drawers. A smear of red-brown paint tracked up a stool leg. Lucien followed each mark with his eyes. Each small detail nudged the suspicion into a plan. He left Claudette to lock the front and walked to the rooming house where Mile de Frezin lodged. The street smelled of wet coal and horse. Leon Gambettis' street lamp sputtered as he passed. He kept his back straight and his steps even. Suspicion did not mean accusation until it stood on proof. Mile opened the door with paint still on his knuckles. He had not shaved. Lucien watched the artist's hands fidget toward a jar of brushes. "Mile. Luciani, need to ask about your hours last night." The name landed with weight. Mile's face closed like a shutter. "Inspector Moreau. Mile returned late nights are my craft." "Why?" He rubbed his palms down his trousers, paint flakes clinging like a confession. Lucien smelled turpentine sharp against the warm starch of the walls. Suspicion shifted to pressure. Lucien tightened the pace of his questions. "An apprentice vanished from your studio." "Lucien, there is fresh paint on the floor, new strokes on a portrait, and a torn note behind the canvas." He watched Mile carefully for a reaction. Mile's jaw jumped and then settled. "Me work is private." Mile snapped at me. "Models come and go. I do not keep people here against their will." His words were quick. His fingers tightened around the palette knife he held like a talisman. Lucien noted the knife's worn edge and the smear of dark red on its handleware were you between 11 and 1. Lucien at home, painting, Miles said as I always do he spoke, with a practiced arrogance that rose into desperation. Inspector, do not turn my studio into a theatre for gossip. Lucien's suspicion became a probe. He about the apprentices' tasks, the names of those who visited lately, and whether anyone had quarreled with Madame Lenoir. Miles answered each question with short, guarded sentences, then offered a sudden confession. I have obsessed, he said he have woken to alter the portrait. But I did not take anyone. I only painted. He thrust the knife into a jar of thinner, as if to puncture the claim. Lucien held the confession without promise. You altered the portrait. When was the last time you left it alone? He asked. He cannot say. One night I paint the eyes, then the next night I touch the mouth. It is my work, Miles said. He did not name the hours. Lucien left him with that admission and returned to the atelier with answers that raised more questions. Back in the studio, Claudette had made tea and set a cup by the easel, hands trembling less but not steady. She watched Lucien with the watchful loyalty of someone who had guarded one house for decades. I found this tucked behind the easel, she said, offering the cameo brooch on a small cloth. She blinked and held it out like an offering. Lucien took the brooch. The miniature inside was a painted likeness of Madame Lenoir at the time of the portrait, hair dark and pinned low. The metal was warm from Claudette's palm. A thread of dried paint clung to the pin. He ran a gloved thumb over the cameo's edge and felt a ridge where it had been pressed in haste. Where did you find it? He asked. It behind the easel, pressed into the frame's cavity. I thought perhaps Miles had misplaced it. He insists he does not know. Claudette's voice broke the sentence into fragments. I have kept this studio since Monsieur de Frezin returned. I would not lie. Her hands smoothed the cloth. Lucien watched her face. The lines at her temples moved when she swallowed. He recorded the detail, her faithful small movements, because loyalty could hide fear or shame. He tucked the cameo into an evidence envelope and held it against his chest for a beat. The physical weight grounded his next choice. He searched the office alcove. A drawer sat locked. Claudette produced a key from her ribbon and trembled as she fit it into place. The lock yielded to a careful twist. Inside lay folded sketches, bills, and one folded letter addressed to Madame Lenoir in a hand that was not Miles. Lucien unfolded it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and oil. The handwriting read like someone speaking softly but with resolve. I have seen too much here. I fear being kept alive only as a memory. If anything happens to me, tell Mother I forgave her. The line struck like a peg. It contained the precise fear Lucien had been chasing. He read it twice, letting each sentence land. The letter moved the investigation from disappearance to possible confinement. He felt a new emotion rise, protective resolve masked as quiet anger. His fingers tightened on the page. He had obligations beyond patience. A noise at the far door made both of them turn. Rain pelted the panes. Steps approached the courtyard. Lucien's hand went to the felt of his hat. The external event arrived. Someone knocked once and then, impatiently, twice. Lucien opened. Miles stood there, paint on his cuffs, breath coming in shallow pulls. He held a small lantern that trembled with his hand. Inspector, Miles said you should not have looked in my drawer. The line was accusation, not regret. Lucien shut the door behind him and guided him to the studio center. Miles, where were you at midnight? He demanded. The room tightened with the question. Miles' shoulders bunched. He spoke quickly, slept a little, then woke to a sound like scraping. I went to the easel. The portrait's mouth looked wrong to me. He stopped, searching Lucien's face. His voice grew soft. Airy. Alter what needs altering. I do not lock people away. I do not. He flinched and swallowed. The confrontation slid into a rapid exchange. You say you touched the portrait at midnight. Lucien's eyes. Miles replied. He smoothed a brushstroke. I found the apprentice's cot empty in the morning. I tell you again, I did not hold him then. Why is there a fresh smear leading from the chamber? Lucien. He kept his sentences short and direct because someone left in a hurry. Mile, Snapet, perhaps the apprentice ran. Lucien pressed on who else had access. Miles' answer came in a string of names and denials. The exchange grew heated for a moment, 3 quick back and forths as their voices rose and dipped, each sentence a chip away at the other's certainty. Claudette's presence in the room acted as a brake. She hummed under her breath and kept her hands busy, fingers worrying a cloth. Suddenly Claudette moved to the easel and pulled the canvas half away. Behind the frame, lodged where Lucien had first found the scrap, a narrow seam opened to reveal a false panel. Her eyes widened. "I have never seen that before," she said. She reached and found a pinch of cloth caught in the joint. The seam yielded to her patience and a small, damp bundle fell free. They unwrapped it together. Inside lay a small cot blanket no larger than a child's, streaked with paint and the faint scent of rose. A ribbon threaded through the cloth bore a name stitched in hurried hand: Lucy. That single detail bent the Casa. Madame Lenoir knew a Lucy. Claudette. She looked to Lucien for confirmation, and the question landed like a new worry. Mile went pale. He stepped back and nearly knocked over his palette. "Stand. Lucy is nothing to me. He said she was a model years ago. If she came here, I did not keep her." He avoided the cameo and the letter on the table. An external event snapped the room, a scraping from the back wall, as if something had been shifted in the secret space. Lucien moved to the panel and pressed. He found another seam and, with a jolt of effort, pushed it open. The room revealed a cramped back chamber no larger than a storage closet. It contained a small cot, a tin basin, and imprints in the straw. The air smelled of stale paint and sweat. The cot straw showed signs of recent use. Lucien stepped inside. He brushed a ragged curtain aside and found footprints numbered in the dust, fresh and leading to a narrow window. A smear of paint led from the cot out toward the window as if someone had escaped. He crouched and felt the dried paint through the sole of a boot print. He called the facts aloud in short statements: footprints. Paint trail to the window. Blanket with a name. Each phrase built the case with concrete evidence. Miles stood at the doorway, voice cracking. "He never meant harm. He said he intended to preserve her likeness." I thought he stopped. The sentence came out in choked fragments. Claudette folded her hands across her chest, eyes fixed on the cot. The confrontation turned physical without violence. Miles stumbled forward and pressed his hand to his face as if to hold back tears. Lucien did not touch him, but he pinned the artist with a steady look. "Where did the apprentice go?" he demanded. "I do not know," Miles answered. He bristled, then offered a sudden detail. "There was a scrap of canvas in the yard today. Torn as if someone had dragged themselves through hedges." That revelation shifted suspicion again. The question became not who had taken someone, but whether the missing person had escaped. Lucien inspected the window. It had been forced from the outside, the frame scraped along one side. The latch hung loose. Outside, a narrow ledge spilled into the courtyard and then down to the cobbles. The rain would have carried footprints quickly away. He felt the urgency settle into his limbs. He needed to widen the search before the trail vanished. They gathered what they could. Claudette handed Lucien the faded miniature and the folded letter. Miles, shaking, produced a scrap of the apprentice's work apron with a torn button still attached. Each object was a tether to a person who might still be alive. Lucien cuffed his coat tighter. He made a choice. He sealed the studio as best he could but left the easel accessible to preserve evidence. He instructed Claudette to tend to the studio's records and told Miles to remain available for questioning. Claudette nodded and began to write down visitors' names from memory. Her handwriting was precise. She listed a string of patrons and models, each name a map to check. Before he left, Lucien paused at the doorway. He turned his head and looked back at the portrait. Madame Lenoir's painted gaze seemed to hold a different angle now, the left cheek catching light where there had been none. Lucien felt the old suspicion crest into a cold, accountable certainty. Someone had been kept in the studio and had left, or had been taken away and removed through the back window. He could not yet tell which. On the threshold, Claudette caught his sleeve. Her fingers were small and Colestine Spectre. She said, "Take the cameo. Guard it. Promise me." She looked him in the eye, so that the request could not be refused. Lucien closed his hand around the cameo in its paper and slid it into his inner pocket. He felt its weight like a small, solid fact. He nodded. "Once will follow every lead," he said. His voice had no grand tone. It was the low, careful sound of someone who carried responsibility. He left the atelier under gaslight and rain. The courtyard gate slammed behind him. He paused at the street and checked his coat, counting the inventory of details he already held, the scrap of paper, the cameo, the letter, the cot's impressions. The paint trail to the window, Miles' confession about altering the portrait, and Claudette's steady witness. Each item tightened the framework of his suspicion into lines he could pursue. Before dawn, he walked toward the police station to file the report and to put out queries to nearby boarding houses. He did not stride. He kept his steps measured against the list of facts. The city had many alleys and small rooms where a person could vanish, rooms with stairs that creak, cellars with locked doors, boats that slip away on the sign. Each possibility required a different set of actions. As he walked, he rehearsed questions in short sentences. Who saw the apprentice last? Who else knew Madame Lenoir? Why did Miles alter the portrait at midnight? Why was a name stitched inside a blanket? The last concrete event of the night was a plan: secure witnesses, check the boarding houses, circulate the cameo's description, and trace the paint's pigment back to a supplier. A courier from the station met him at the gate with a note. It was brief, a complaint from a neighbor about a figure seen near the canal at 2 in the morning. Lucien folded the note and put it into his pocket. He felt a change. The case had shifted from an isolated studio to the wider city. That movement altered how he would act. He walked on under the lamplight, the cameo pressing against his chest, Claudette's request like a hinge. He would follow the paint, follow the names, and follow the window's tracks. He had pockets of evidence and a rising list of suspects. The night had given him one immediate, brutal fact. Someone had been close enough to be kept and close enough to disappear. He tightened his coat against the rain and set his course for the lodging houses. The cameo's cool edge rested near his heart. He moved with a plan sharpened by suspicion and the quiet resolve to find whomever Lucy might be, or to find proof that she had chosen to leave. The studio's door closed behind him, a sound that made his next choice clear: pursue the trail before the rain washed it away. Lucien seized Miles' wrist. The brush fell from the artist's fingers and struck the paint-scattered floor. Suspicion tightened Lucien's jaw as he held Miles back from the easel. Where is he? Lucien, where is the apprentice who never answered Claudette's call? Water ran in drips from Lucien's coat. Rain darkened the hem. He remembered forcing the warped latch earlier that night, and the way the door had given with a groan. The missing apprentice was the immediate stake. The portrait on the easel held the secondary mystery. The canvas had acquired a new detail since he last saw it. Lucien needed answers now. The room smelled of turpentine, wet wool, and the faintly sweet scent Claudette belonged to Madame Lenoir. This smell answered him to the castle. Lucien, Miles said, pulling his hand free and wiping his palm on his smock. You have no right to seize me like that. His voice shortened into sharp words. No right. Lucien. Claudette. The boy did not answer. The satchel lies abandoned. The back stairs are torn. Who else would leave like that? Miles' face tightened. He moved toward the easel with hands that trembled. The canvas changed. Lucien, Miles said, he found a stain I could not remove. I tried to correct it. I thought. He stopped, and his fingers worked on an imagined smear. Claudette crossed the studio with a small table in her hands and placed a faded locket on top of the pile of letters. Claudette's hands shook as she set the locket down. I went to fetch a lamp for me, she said. He called and called. He did not answer at the stairs. The back stair felt wet where he passed. Then the locket fell and the sleeve was torn. She spoke plainly. Her voice carried the practicality of someone who catalogued small losses and made them into proof. Claudette, Lucien. Show me the sleeve. He moved with a calm that disguised the speed of his decisions. He crouched and touched the satchel on the floor. The leather was damp. He unfastened it and found a ledger with pages stamped by dampness. The apprentice's pen lay lodged in a corner. A smear of dark paint marred one page. You saw it change. Lucien Moreau eyes on the portrait. Moreau nodded and wrapped fingers around the edge of the easelays. When I stepped away for a moment, the mouth was plain. Now it has a curl. I swear it was not there at dusk. Moreau's words came in a rush of played emotion, charm, then defense. Lucien tapped his fingers twice against his notebook. The tapping is how he bought time, how he catalogued a thought. He had long used small gestures to steady himself when the evidence sat like an accusing weight. He closed the distance and leaned over the portrait, bringing a small lamp to bear on the canvas. The lamp revealed a thin seam of fresh varnish and a faint brushstroke along the lower lip. Lucien held the lamp closer and saw an underpainting beneath the visible face, a different jawline, a painted scar on the left eyebrow, a shadow of hair pinned differently. He thought of the apprentice's vanished footsteps on the back stairs. The underlayer suggested deliberate alteration. Moreau watched him and shifted from defensive to near panish. You had to know. Moreau said you would understand why I hid it. His voice heated and cooled in quick succession. Understand what? Lucien, understand who I painted before she sat for me. Understand why I painted over him. Who? Lucien. He kept his words short. Moreau refused to meet his gazier man. A boy once my apprentice's brother. I thought I could correct him, keep him safe in the canvas. I thought the paint could hold what the world broke. Moreau's hands crumpled the edge of his smock. Claudette stepped forward. Moreau, she said, low and urgent. You promised me you would not bring that trouble back into this room. Her voice carried age and insistence. She named him. Moreau blinked as if pricked by a needly promise to keep the door shut. She added. The studio's order fractured. Stretched canvases leaned like doors against one another. Threadbare chairs sat in a symmetry. Lucien used the disorder to search. He checked the easel, the worktable, the shelves, the splattered rags. He noted every scuff and placed them in his mind as a detective catalogues evidence. Tell me precisely where he was last, Lucien. His voice grew sharper. Claudette. Again he came to help me bandage Moreau's hand once, she said, fetched the lamp and hummed a tune about the river. He went behind the stacked canvases and did not come out when I called. I heard nothing. I found the torn sleeve at the back landing. The satchel was thrown down as if in a hurry. Lucien moved to the stacked canvases and pulled one aside. He felt the raw edges rub against his fingers, paint tacky to his glove. Behind them, a narrow seam in the wall showed a faint shadow, a seam not part of the original wall. He pressed and found a loose panel. The panel swung inward and exposed a cramped alcove, its floor powdered with dust disturbed recently. He crouched and shone his lamp into the niche. A torn letter, its folds sodden at the corner, lay near a small child's doll wrapped in oilcloth. Lucien's fingers hesitated before he touched either object. He lifted the doll and the oilcloth left a smear of old paint on his glove. The letter bore a hand he did not yet recognize. Claudette watched him and hums threaded. The silence. This was hidden years ago. She said he kept it from him when he, the artist, asked me to. She folded her hands. Her voice hitched in a place where loyalty and fear met. Moreau said nothing at first, but his knuckles whitened. Lucien opened the letter at its damp fold. The ink had run slightly, but the words remained legible. A name, a plea, a date. The plea spoke of a child entrusted to an atelier for a short time and of promises exchanged in the dark. The letter named Madame Lenoir in the third line. Lucien read the name aloud. Madame Lenoir, Moreau said, and his tone softened, then hardened. She sat more than once. She wanted one portrait. She wanted a memory she could carry when the world took her away. His hands found the corner of a canvas, as though anchoring himself to something real. The discovery forced a shift in suspicion. Lucien had entered with doubt toward Miles' explanation. Now he perceived a possible motive and a new question. The underpainting suggested that someone had repainted a face. The hidden alcove suggested someone had been kept nearby. The torn letter suggested promises made. The pieces began to rearrange. Lucien's suspicion turned into a sharper urgency to know who had been hidden and why. Miles flinched and then spoke in bursts. He painted to keep. I painted to hold her him so he would not go away again. He stop at you speak in riddles, Miles. Who is he, Lucien? Miles swallowed and named the man whose underpainting matched the scar. Antoine. He apprenticed here years ago. He vanished the night of the market fire and Miles never said where he went. Claudette's hands fluttered to her locket. Antoine was a trouble, she said, but he came back once. And Miles covered him in oils like binding a wound. After that he kept the alcove shut, and he would not let anyone near the painting at night. Her voice grew thin as she placed the locket back into her palm. Lucien paced the studio in small marching steps. He counted evidence aloud to himself like a litany. Footprints by the inner door. A knocked-over chair in the dressing room, Claudette had said. The torn sleeve, the vanished apprentice, a changed mouth on the portrait. He rearranged the list and found a pattern, the painting, the alcove, and the man's name. Each new item tightened the net around Miles' intentions. You kept someone here. Lucien to Miles or no? The question pulled Miles' eyes to the floor. He swallowed as he said finally for a time. Antoine stayed. I painted him because the light on his face in the morning reminded me of things I had lost. I told myself paint could slow a forgetting. Lucien stepped closer until he was within arm's reach of Miles. He allowed himself a short, measured breath and then asked, why paint over him? Why alter the portrait? Miles' reply was immediate and pained because she came. Madame Lenoir sat for me, and she asked me to make a likeness for her family. I could not say the truth to them. I could not say. A silence fell. Claudette cleared her throat and spoke with the bluntness of someone who had watched choices harden into consequences. You promised me to keep secrets out of the ledger, Miles. You promised to keep the atelier clean of trouble. You kept your promise until you could not. Lucien turned again to the painting. He moved his lamp along the canvas and found the scar under the visible paint. The scar matched a small physical mark he had noted on Miles' face, the thin scar along Miles' left eyebrow. The match suggested the underpainting had once represented Miles or someone close to him if Antoine was here. Lucien, then where did he go now? The alcove is empty. The dressing room shows footprints. Who opened that inner door? He looked at Miles and waiting for the artist to make a choice. Miles' jaw clenched. He then in a rush he did not open it tonight. I locked the inner door. I swore. But last night I thought the portrait had learned something it should not hold. I went to scrape a line away and patch it. I heard steps below. I hurried. When I came back, the dressing room door had been forced and the chair was overthrown. I found scratches on the floor and a scarf gone. I do not know what happened next. That confession shifted the room again. Lucien's anger, which had flared in his voice, cooled into a methodical probe. He miled for the lock's key. Miles provided it with hands that trembled. Lucien took the key and walked to the inner door. The metal bit of the lock was cold under his palm. He fit the key and eased the bolt. The door swung inward on hinges that breathed a creak. The dressing room revealed fresh footprints crossing a low rug. A chair lay toppled and a small sewing of a cameo thread snagged the upholstery. A scarf rested over a single chair arm, damp at the edge. The scarf carried a faint scent of old roses and bergamot that Lucien associated with Madame Lenoir. Claudette bent and picked up the cameo thread, bringing it to her cheek. Her mouth trembled and she said, "This came from her Madame Lenoir's brooch. It is the same thread I sewed on her collar once when she left the house in haste." Her hands tightened into a fist. Lucien's questions multiplied. He checked the footprints. They led from the dressing room to the inner doorway, and then stopped as if someone had stepped into a narrow space and then vanished. He felt the floorboards with gloved fingers and found a soft give near the base of a painted cabinet. He pressed and a hinge revealed a small trap-like seam. He worked it open and found nothing but smudged dust. The trail seemed to end in the studio itself. Mile cried out suddenly and moved toward a corner where a chair held a folded coat stop. "Lucien, Mile, do not touch anything." Mile obeyed only after a moment, his breath short. He pointed to the coat and said, "He used to wear that scarf." Antoine. The scarf in the dressing room. He took his old things sometimes. He would leave them here and then take them away. Lucien pulled the coat from the chair and found a small scrap of paper tucked into its lining. The scrap had a single name and a date. The name was not Antoine. Lucien's eyebrows narrowed. The date matched a social notice from years before. He compared it to the letter he had found in the alcove. The two papers suggested not one secret but several, layered and restricted by time. A new sense of urgency seized him. He could feel the change in his body. The steady baritone in his voice tightened. His fingers stopped tapping and instead gripped the lamp. Suspicion had led him in. Now doubt braided with a growing fear that someone very close to the atelier had been moved. He had to act. "Claudette," he said. "Who else knows the attic? The back stairs?" Antoine. Miles passed. She listed names with small, clipped words. Neighbors, a market vendor, a woman at the boarding house. None gave him the immediate clarity he wanted. He felt the case pull like a rope with too many knots. They argued then in a short flare of lines. "You made a web. Lucien, you trapped someone with paint. I tried to preserve a life." Miles shot back. "You should not have kept him at all. Lucien, you did not have the right." Claudette added, "Mile, you lied to me. You lied to the family. I was trying to keep him safe." Miles said the world would take him. "I believed." The exchange ran its course in 5 quick lines and left a bruise in the air. The argument ended with Miles slumping into a chair and covering his face. Claudette moved to the lamp and refilled it without asking. Lucien collected the torn letter and flattened it on his palm, reading the final lines again. The letter named a place on the Seine where a woman once waited, and where Madame Lenoir had been seen leaving in a hurry. The place was a detail they could pursue. Lucien made decisions in short declarative sentences. "We'll trace that place on the Seine," he said. "Claudette, stay here and keep the studio as it is. Mile, you will not touch the painting again until I return. Bring me any names Antoine used. Tell me everything you told him and everything you did not." His words landed like small hammers, and the room accepted them. Before he left, Lucien bent low and inspected the portrait one last time. The mouth had a faint curl he had not seen earlier. He raised his lamp and saw the varnish had dried in a way that suggested a recent retouch. He pocketed the torn letter and the scrap of paper and told the others he would be back by mid-afternoon. They watched him cross the studio and step through the splintered doorway he had opened in the previous night. At the threshold he paused. He did not speak a vow. He simply looked back at the portrait, at Mile, at Claudette. He noted the damp hem of the apprentice's satchel on the floor and the empty dressing room door ajar. He closed the studio door with a measured pull and took the street into the rain. Carrying the name written on the scrap of paper and the image of the portrait's changed mouth. He walked without hurry, but his mind moved quickly through questions and possible routes. Suspicion had guided his first moves. It shifted to anger when Mile admitted concealment. It turned to doubt when the alcove and the letter suggested layers of secrecy. Now it settled into a working clarity. He had a lead on Madame Lenoir and a place on the Seine to check. The case's next step would be concrete: follow the name, question witnesses, and find where a person could be moved under cover of paint. As dawn softened the rain, Lucien kept the torn letter folded in his pocket. He felt the weight of it as a real thing. The portrait's mouth, the vanished apprentice, the alcove, Antoine's name, these were not ideas, but objects and names he could trace. He tightened his collar against the cold and started toward the place the letter named. That moving step closed the chapter's immediate tension while leaving an open direction for what must come next. When he reached the corner, he looked once more over his shoulder at the building where the artist's light burned behind drawn blinds. The studio's single lamp blinked against the rain. He turned and walked on with the letter, the scrap, and the picture of a mouth that had gained a curl he could not explain. The curl followed him into the street like a question he was obliged to answer. Lucien pried the crate open, and the cameo fell into his palm with the faint smell of oil and urine. Suspicion tightened his mouth as he turned the brooch. The metal pin still held flecks of dark paint. Claudette brought this, he asked without looking up. Claudette Morel's hands shook when she stepped forward and nodded, voice low. Monsieur. I wrapped it myself after I found it beneath the easel last night. The central problem was immediate and concrete. An object tied to a disappearance had left the atelier and resurfaced in evidence. And Lucien suspected someone inside the studio had moved evidence before the police could secure the scene. He left the crate open and shouldered into the corridor, coat dripping from rain he had not bothered to wipe away. Lucien's suspicion pushed him to quick decisions. He sent 2 men to fetch the key to the atelier and lifted his brass watch to check time with a small, tight movement. He thought of the apprentice who had not answered Claudette's call in Chapter 1, and of how, in the second visit, he had seized Miles' wrist while the brush clattered from the man's fingers. Those moments were not memories for Lucien so much as items to be tested, like a lock to be tried again with a different key. They reached the atelier to find the street still wet and the gaslight guttering. Lucien paused at the doorway long enough to note the threshold's splintered boards and the smear of muddy shoeprints that led inside. Claudette kept close, clutching her silver locket under her shawl. He did not answer when I called, she said again, and the words were a repetition that pressed into Lucien like a repeated knock. Lucien replied, "Stay here. Keep the door clear." He stepped into the studio with the certainty of someone checking the most obvious hazard first. Inside, the easel stood against the north wall, the half-finished portrait tilted toward the single grimy window. A new note of urgency replaced suspicion when Lucien bent and saw the mouth had a fresh wet stroke along the lower lip, paint still catching the light. He touched the rim of the canvas with a gloved finger and left a clean print. Mile, Lucien. Voice controlled. Where were you after midnight? The question pushed the investigation forward. It demanded an answer, and it was meant to press Miles' temper into the open. Mile de Frezin looked up from the far corner where he had been pacing, sleeves smeared in drying earth-colored paint and turpentine. His face tightened. He painted, Inspector. I painted all night, Miles said, breath quick. He stepped toward the easel in a movement that combined hunger and fear. Lucien moved between the man and the canvas and watched Miles' hands, fingers stained, knuckles white where he gripped a palleted knife hidden in his smock. Claudette crossed the studio floor and set the brooch on a small iron table, then hovered with hands folded so tightly the knuckles showed. Lucien felt the first emotion shift. Suspicion curdled into urgency as he considered how the brooch tied a missing person to the portrait, and how the fresh stroke suggested someone had altered the painting very recently. He took a breath and asked, "Who else touched the canvas overnight?" Miles' mouth opened and closed. "No one. No one but me." Madame Lenoir visited earlier by appointment. She stood for a minute, then left. Claudette's voice broke in. She left alone. I locked the outer door after her. Lucien noted the hesitation in Claudette's tone, and the way Miles' jaw tightened when Madame Lenoir's name came up. The hesitation suggested concealment. Lucien's jaw tightened in turn. He stepped behind the easel, scanning the floor. The studio smelled of linseed and old paper. A pile of wet rags sat in a basin near the sink. Lucien's eyes caught the outline of a narrow seam in the baseboard behind the easel. He pressed a gloved thumb along the seam and felt the grain of wood give. Action followed suspicion. He pried the panel away and a dry, dark pocket opened like a throat. Inside were torn letters, a register of names written in a cramped hand, and a damp scrap folded to reveal Madame Lenoir's handwriting at the corner letters, Lucien. Pulling them free. He read aloud a name and apprentices, then another. The register confirmed a list of men who had apprenticed here, and one name was crossed out twice. This is deliberate, Lucien. The second emotion shift arrived. Doubt slipped into anger when the pattern of crossed names suggested someone had hidden names before the disappearances became public. Mile moved as if to lunge for the papers, and Lucien's hand closed on his forearm with a practiced restraint. Mile, Lucien. Calm that did not invite argument. You will not touch that the inspector's grip held, because he had already handled Mile once. And because memories of the brush falling from Mile's fingers were fresh and telling. Mile jerked his arm away and laughed, a sound like a snapped string. You think I would hide them? You think I? He took a step toward Lucien and then halted as Lucien's gaze did not waver. Rapid dialogue flared. Where is the apprentice? Lucien demanded. He don't know. Mile snapped. You seized my wrist. I did that because you lunged for the easel last night. Lucien replied. Explain where he went. Claudette. Inspector, I found the brooch under the easel, and I thought of the apprentice who keeps his pocket watch in that box. Her voice trembled. The conversation drove the scene. Each short line revealed a different stress point. Lucien set the letters on the table and spread them carefully to expose dates and signatures. He read a damp fragment where Madame Lenoir had written the apprentice's name with an instruction to erase him from the ledger. Why would she cross his name? Lucien aloud. No one answered. The possibility of a deliberate concealment began to feel like a motive that arranged itself around the painting and the people nearest it. Lucien's hands moved with purpose. He collected the papers and placed them in an evidence envelope. He instructed his men to photograph the seam and the fresh stroke on the painted mouth. Madame Lenoir arrived then, opening the studio door as if she had walked in from the street at will, dry and composed. She wore a gown of muted gold and carried a folding fan. Her cameo brooch was set at her throat and was clean. Her presence changed the energy in the room. Lucien noted the way her eyes moved over the easel with blass attention, and how she kept her gaze away from Miles' hands. Madame Lenoir, Lucien, you returned earlier. You saw the apprentice. She inclined her head with a small half-smile that shifted as her eyes darkened. He was here for the pose, and then I left. Mile and I have known each other some years, Inspector. He understands my requirements. Claudette's mouth tightened when Madame Lenoir spoke. She glanced at Mile, then at Lucien. Madame Lenoir's calm peeled back when Claudette stepped forward and set the brooch on the table, sliding it toward the woman. This came from under your easel, Madame. Claudette was at the scene after the apprentice vanished. Madame Lenoir's fingers paused above the brooch but did not close. She looked at the cameo and then at Claudette. That brooch. I have not worn it for years, she said slowly. Lucien watched Madame Lenoir's breathing and the slight flare of nostrils. He decided to test her composure. Why is your handwriting on a damp scrap hidden behind the easel? He asked. Madame Lenoir's face shifted in a small, controlled way that suggested memory rather than deceit. He wrote a note asking Mile to remove certain names from his register when apprentices proved unsuitable. She said he thought the registry would be better pruned. Miles' voice cut in. You me to remove them. He sounded both affronted and afraid. Madame Lenoir replied, but I meant only those who left of their own will. Claudette's hand flew to her locket. Lucien felt the scene tilt again. A new suspicion was directed at Madame Lenoir's past interventions in the atelier rather than at Mile alone. Lucien ordered Mile to stay back and had 2 constables hold the studio door. He knelt by the easel to examine the painted mouth more closely. The lower lip's fresh stroke still had a wet sheen. He pressed the tip of a paper to the stroke and lifted a smear. The smear smelled of turpentine and a different flower scent, old roses, an odor Lucien associated with Madame Lenoir from earlier interviews. He called out, "Claudette, did you clean any of Miles' brushes last night?" Claudette shook her head. "No, monsieur. I swept and I locked the front. I did not touch his palette." The urgency mounted. Lucien's actions accelerated in response. While Lucien dealt with the paint, one constable reported a muffled sound from behind the canvas, a scrape, a muffled cough. Lucien's hand froze on the smear. He gripped the canvas edge and pried it wider. The scrap of board behind the stretch revealed a small, cramped hollow and a pair of eyes blinking in the dim help. A hoarse voice whispered, "Please, the discovery was the mid-chapter mini cliffhanger. The presumed corpse or lost apprentice was alive and hidden." And everything that had been a hypothesis snapped into immediate rescue. Lucien's heart rate increased in a physical way he noted and controlled. His hands moved to pull the boarding free, while one constable passed a lamp forward. The apprentice, young, pale, with a smear of blue paint on his temple, pressed his hands to his ribs and tried to sit. Lucien felt relief and anger at once. The relief that someone had not been killed turned quickly into the anger that someone had put a living man behind a canvas. "Who did this?" Lucien demanded. Miles lurched forward and reached for a lamp. Lucien's other emotion shift occurred. The earlier urgency swerved into heated confrontation. Miles moved as if to snatch the lamp. "No," Lucien, stepping to intercept. Rapid lines of dialogue snapped between them. "Miles, stay back, he should have been quiet." Miles Barkett awoke the whole night with his cuffing. "Who put him there?" "Lucien, not I," Miles shouted. "He slept in the back." "I would not." His hands went to his smock. Lucien remembered the scrape of Miles' knuckles on the palette knife and reached to restrain him. A scuffle began when Miles seized a lamp and lunged for the canvas. Turpentine tipped and a small ripple of flame caught a rag. The struggle turned violent in a close, sharp moment. Miles' shoulder struck Lucien. Lucien blocked with his forearm, and the apprentice crawled out on hands and knees as the constables closed in. The physical fight was short and ugly. Miles' breath came ragged. His palms had paint flecks and dried scars. "She wouldn't stop crying in his sleep." Miles said between lunges. "The girl who taught him left. He kept asking about her. Who taught him?" Lucien barked, "What girl?" Miles did not answer directly. Madame Lenoir stepped forward then with a steadying motion and said, "Stop. He will only make this worse." Her voice held a different tone now, less theatrical, more clipped. Lucien held Miles down while one constable snapped cuffs on the artist's wrist. Miles' chest heaved. He spat. "You have no right. You tried to hide a man in your studio." Lucien replied, "He will be taken for questioning." That exchange resolved the immediate physical conflict. The climax had burned through with the single peak the outline required. After Miles was restrained, Lucien knelt beside the apprentice and asked, "What is your name?" The boy swallowed and said, "Henry." Lucien tested Henry's responses, pupils constricted, speech slow but coherent. He small, concrete questions: where he had been, who had put him there, and Henry named no names immediately. Claudette bent close and brushed a damp hair from Henry's temple, kept to himself. She said he heard him sing sometimes when he mixed colors. He spoke of wanting to learn only. Claudette's description added urgency to exact answers. Lucien's questions tightened like a vice. Lucien turned the damp scrap of Madame Lenoir's handwriting over and found a brief instruction dated 2 nights earlier, to remove names of certain apprentices. He showed it to Madame Lenoir and to Miles. "These are your marks," he said to Miles. Away was Henry, squeezed behind the easel. Miles' answer broke in short sentence. "Sesh would not leave. He saw something I did not want to be found." "What did he see?" "Lucien saw the portrait move," Miles said. The 3 words landed like a splinter. Lucien held his face impassive. He forced his next question slowly. "Describe how it moved." Miles' voice dropped the mouth. "It changed in the night. I would scrape it, and then it would be different in the morning." Henry saw it. He talked about it at his breakfast. He had looked tired and then hungry. The allegation changed the investigation's shape. No longer only concealment and danger. Now testimony that the painting behaved in ways two witnesses associated with the disappearances. Lucien felt clarity gather at the edges of evidence, the brooch under the easel, the damp scrap with Madame Lenoir's hand, the fresh stroke on the mouth, Henry hidden alive, and Miles' volatile attempts to guard the canvas. He turned to Madame Lenoir. "Why did you ask names to be removed?" He forced the question again. Madame Lenoir's jaw tightened, and she answered in measured phrases. "Appearances are a currency. She said apprentices who hurt my reputation were to be gone from the list. I did not mean harm. I do not know what Miles did after I left." Lucien listened to each clipped sentence for evasion. He watched the micro-gestures, Madame Lenoir's fingers tracing the cameo chain, Claudette folding her hands tighter, Henry's shoulders shaking as he tried to remain upright. A twist arrived then that altered how Lucien understood past events. In the torn register, he found a second set of ink marks that corresponded to nights when apprentices had disappeared. The pattern matched Madame Lenoir's visits and letters requesting names be removed. The twist suggested an influence that had been more active and more deliberate than simple vanity. Lucien pushed this into a question. "You for names to be removed after certain visits. Did you ask Miles to punish them?" Madame Lenoir's hand brushed the fan. "Closidi asked for discretion, not punishment. She said if someone threatened my patronage, she did not finish. And her incompletion served as accusation enough." Lucien had decisions to make. He arranged Henry on a chair and ordered hot tea for him. He instructed the constables to take Miles for custody and to photograph the studio in full. He had Henry carried to the outer room and wrapped in a blanket. He addressed Claudette quietly. "You found the brooch. You kept it. Why did you not bring it to the police sooner?" Claudette's hands found the silver locket at her throat, and she said, "I feared scandal. I feared Miles would be ruined and the apprentices blamed. I thought Madame Lenoir would protect us. If I kept silent, the admission revealed motive and fear." Claudette's loyalty to Miles and to the atelier explained her earlier concealment. Before they left, Madame Lenoir moved to the painting and laid a fingertip on the lower lip. With an odd gentleness, she was calm once. Madame Lenoir whispered to the portrait, and the studio inhaled the sound. Lucien watched her. He did not let authority waver. He asked, "Madame Lenoir, you will come with us to the station for questioning." She inclined her head in a slow, deliberate motion. "I will. I will give what I must." Her concession was a small, concrete action that redirected the investigation into the legal realm, rather than into rumor. At noon, the atelier had settled into a brittle quiet. Miles had been taken away with cuffs and a complaint lodged for unlawful restraint. Henry sat wrapped in a blanket and answered Lucien's pointed questions in short phrases. He had been kept behind the canvas for near 2 nights. He had heard Miles mutter about preserving the painting, and he admitted he had sometimes seen Madame Lenoir watching the portrait longer than necessary. Lucien filed the statements in his notebook and checked the register once more. The emotional arc of the day had moved suspicion into rescue and into legal resolution. Yet Lucien felt an unease that did not vanish. The unease was concrete. He had found proofs and a living apprentice. But he had not yet explained why the portrait appeared to change or why Miles had reacted with such ferocity. He walked Madame Lenoir to the outer steps as constables prepared a cart for Miles. Claudette stood in the doorway holding her silver locket against her chest as if it were a talisman. Lucien noticed how her hands trembled and how she kept looking at the portrait from the threshold. "Inspector," she said softly, "forgive me. I thought I was keeping the atelier safe." Lucien answered with his practiced economy. "You will give a statement, Claudette." "Tell everything." She nodded and moved to shut the studio doors. As she did, Madame Lenoir stopped at the threshold, unpinned a cameo and set it on the step with the smallest of deliberate motions. She did not speak. Lucien picked the brooch up with gloved fingers and felt the cold metal. The final consequences arranged themselves practically Mile would be charged for unlawful restraint and assault for hiding Henry and for the violent scuffle. Madame Lenoir would face questioning about her written orders to remove apprentice names and about her influence over the studio's internal records. Claudette would give testimony about where she found the brooch and why she delayed contacting the police. Henry would be placed under care and given a chance to recover while the station processed statements. Lucien made the final arrangement to have the portrait removed under police seal for technical examination. Before leaving, Lucien set his hand against the canvas one last time and felt the give of stretched linen. He focused on a single, concrete measure. The lower lips pigment sample would be tested for fresh paint types and any foreign residues. That act requesting a lab analysis was his instrument against rumor and the uncanny. He did not speak of ghosts. He spoke of solvents, of pigments, and of witness testimony. The practical steps, the arrests, and the collected documents gave the day closure without theatrical pronouncements. Claudette closed the studio door behind them and locked it with keys that Lucien took into evidence. They escorted Henry down the wet street to a carriage waiting to take him to medical care. Claudette pressed her locket to her lips as the carriage rolled away. Madame Lenoir climbed into a separate carriage and did not look back. Miles' cart rattled in another direction with constables in attendance. Lucien watched each figure move away and catalogued the concrete outcomes in his head. A living apprentice rescued, an artist arrested, a patron to be questioned, and a registry exposed as a record of deliberate concealment. He felt no triumph, only the steady satisfaction of tasks accomplished and the persistent, low unease that some answers still awaited chemical tests and formal confessions. At the station, Lucien made his report. He placed the cameo brooch in evidence, filed the torn letters, and typed the statements from Henry, Claudette, and Mile. He instructed the lab to test the fresh stroke on the portrait, and to compare the scent residue on the smear to perfumes long associated with Madame Lenoir. When he finished the paperwork, the detective in him reviewed the chain of events and found it coherent: attempts at concealment, a pattern of names removed after visits, and a violent defense of the canvas by an artist who feared exposure. The physical evidence made the narrative persuasive to any court that would hear it. Before he left the precinct, Lucien called the hospital and confirmed Henry would be kept under observation. He then returned to the scene to oversee the secured removal of the painting. At the atelier's doorway, Claudette held her shawl tighter and looked at Lucien. "Will he be safe?" she asked, naming Henry. Lucien answered plainly, "We'll make sure, Claudette. He will have care and a chance to speak fully when he can." She exhaled once and allowed a small, brittle smile. Lucien folded the file under his arm and closed the casebook with a slow, deliberate motion. As he stepped away from the atelier, Lucien glanced once more at the sealed window where the portrait had hung. He kept his final action concrete. He ordered the studio's register and notes to be entered as evidence, and he made a note to follow Marie de Fresen, Miles' sister, as registered earlier if she appeared in records connected to apprentice placements. He did not leave a rhetorical line. He left instructions. At noon, with Mile in custody and Henry in care, the atelier had a fragile, practical silence. Lucien locked the outer door and handed the key to the constable. Claudette clutched her silver locket and watched Henry's carriage pull away. Madame Lenoir had disappeared into the city with her piece of evidence left at the step, and Lucien felt a firm resolution to let the lab results and witness statements determine the remainder. He recorded the final concrete beat for the day: evidence collected, suspects detained, witness in care. Then he walked away toward the station to file charges and to set the investigations formally in motion. The chapter closed on the tangible: a locked studio, a sealed portrait, an apprentice in medical care, an artist taken to the lockup, and a patron headed for questioning. Lucien kept the brooch wrapped and stored it in the evidence locker, its paint flecks now part of the chain that would hold the story to fact. he did not promise a moral or a new beginning. He left a list of tasks, names to be questioned, and a lab request that would answer whether paint alone could explain the portrait's changes. The last image the reader is given is concrete and immediate. Claudette holding her locket on the studio step as the constable shut the door, and Lucien signed the final receipt for the evidence envelope with the cameo pinned inside.